If a catastrophic crisis hits your company today, the absolute most dangerous thing you as a leader can do is repeat yourself.
Oh, totally. Which sounds entirely backwards, I know.
Right. It
Yeah.
really does. But whether you are managing a small team or running a massive division, today's deep dive is for you. We are looking at this fascinating professional communication guide, along with a recorded debate from industry insiders, all centered on how leaders communicate on their highest pressure days.
Yeah, and the stakes there are just incredibly high.
Exactly. Our mission today is to figure out how an executive can lead without cruelty when, the pressure of the job feels absolutely overwhelming.
It's a profound challenge, honestly. The sources we are analyzing today force a complete reframing of how we think about power dynamics. I mean, usually when we talk about workplace stress, we focus on the underdog,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, the entry-level employee.
Right, the person whose biggest fear is vanishing in the corporate machine. They fear being invisible or getting talked over or just dismissed entirely. But these sources highlight a completely different, deeply internal fear for the person sitting at the head of the table.
Because the executive already has visibility. I mean, they have the title, the corner office, the microphone. So their fear isn't about being ignored at all.
No, their ultimate deep-seated fear is becoming the villain.
Wow. Becoming the villain.
Yeah. Because when you hold power, your poor communication doesn't just isolate you. Like, if an executive snaps or lashes out under extreme stress, they can inflict real psychological collateral damage on dozens of people.
Dozens of people who are relying on them.
Exactly. So the conscious communication tools we're looking at today aren't survival tactics for claiming space.
Mm.
For a leader, these tools act as armor. And crucially, it's not armor meant to deflect incoming fire. As the sources put it, this armor is designed to stop being the one firing the gun. It's about protecting your team from your own stress.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that is a massive paradigm shift. The idea that you are actively building professional armor to stop yourself from shooting at your own team when things go wrong requires a total rewiring of how we view leadership.
It really does.
So where do we even begin with that kind of foundational mindset shift?
Well, we begin with what the guide calls the executive thermostat.
An executive thermostat, got it.
Yeah, so before a leader can even attempt to speak without cruelty, they first have to process the immense emotional pressure of a room without absorbing it. The guide draws a very sharp distinction between operating as a thermometer versus a thermostat.
Okay, and we all know a thermometer just passively reacts to the room.
Exactly. If the environment is panicked, the thermometer spikes. A leader operating like a thermometer simply absorbs the existing anxiety and reflects it right back out, often tenfold.
Wait, but I hear this expectation all the time, though. There's this pervasive myth that great leaders are supposed to be the ultimate sponges for their team.
Oh, the sponge analogy.
Yeah, right. Like you absorb all the incoming problems, all the stress, so your team doesn't have to carry it. But if we think about the physics of that, it's a terrible model. I mean, if you're just a sponge, you eventually get squeezed and all that toxic panic drips right back out onto your team.
That is a great way to put it.
I look at it more like a load-bearing wall. If a load-bearing wall just absorbs all the structural stress of a skyscraper without properly distributing it, the concrete eventually fractures under the immense weight. The whole building comes down.
That structural analogy is incredibly accurate to the psychology at play here. You cannot be the sponge, and you cannot be the load-bearing wall that just silently cracks.
So you have to be the thermostat.
Right. You take conscious action to regulate and shift the environment toward a more productive state. But to achieve that, you have to stop yourself from internalizing that panic in the first place. And that is where the sources introduce a visualization strategy called the glass wall.
Wait, so visualizing a literal wall between you and the team.
A 1-inch pane of soundproof glass. Just imagine it dropping down between yourself and the source of the pressure.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Now, an entry-level employee might use this to block out a toxic boss's yelling. Like,
Yeah.
they see the anger, but the glass physically stops the emotional contagion. But for an executive, the application is different because the psychological burden is different.
How so?
Well, when a team is terrified about, say, a missed deadline or a failing project, leaders have a tendency to internalize that collective fear as a personal indictment of their leadership.
Oh, I see. So if my entire marketing department is freaking out about a terrible quarterly report, I don't just see their stress. I look at them and my brain says, I failed them. I caused this panic. I am an inadequate leader.
Yes. You internalize their panic as your own failure, and it's that internal guilt that makes you defensive and prone to snapping.
That makes so much sense.
So the glass wall is a cognitive boundary to block out that specific guilt. You observe the emotion in the room, you acknowledge the stakes, but you refuse to carry the emotional weight of their panic. To anchor this, the guide provides a specific internal mantra for the executive. That panic is not my command.
That panic is not my command. I
Not
like that. It draws a very clear line.
What's fascinating here is how effectively this neutralizes the specific internal burden of modern leadership. Leaders often feel this intense, overwhelming responsibility to manage everyone's feelings.
Right. Which is exhausting.
Completely. So by internally stating that panic is not my command, the leader is giving their own nervous system permission to remain objective.
Yeah.
You insulate yourself emotionally so your decision-making isn't hijacked by the room's anxiety.
Okay, I see how that creates the necessary foundation.
Yeah.
You've emotionally insulated yourself. The team is in full meltdown mode. Your internal glass wall is up. But eventually you have to lower the drawbridge, right? You have to open your mouth and actually manage the crisis.
Yes, you do.
So how do you translate that internal calm into verbal communication without sounding entirely dismissive or, suddenly aggressive?
That transition relies on a verbal strategy called the I notice assertion.
Which means observing the situation out loud.
Neutrally observing it, yes, rather than launching an accusation. Under pressure, a leader's default is often aggressive framing, like, you are failing or this department is a total mess right now.
Yeah, the blame game.
Exactly. The unnoticed assertion strips away the judgment. You just state an objective fact. You say, I noticed the quarterly numbers dropped, or I noticed there is a lot of stress in this room right now.
So you are explicitly naming the stress out loud.
Yes, and there is a biological reason for this. In psychology, this is known as affect labeling. When you name an emotion out loud neutrally, it actually dials down the threat response in the amygdala.
For both the speaker and the listener.
For both, yeah. By acknowledging the atmosphere as an objective fact, the leader signals safety to the team. You're essentially telling their nervous systems, I see the massive problem, but I am not attacking you for it.
And when you signal safety, you invite problem solving. If a leader yells, employees instinctively hide their mistakes.
Right. If a leader states things neutrally, employees engage to fix them.
Okay, but I have to throw a major reality check at this. Because conceptually, affect labeling sounds great. But let's put ourselves in the shoes of a CEO dealing with a catastrophic crisis. Say, a $50 million product recall that just hit the news cycle.
Okay, high stakes.
Super high stakes. The board is furious, the stock is tanking. If that CEO walks into a boardroom full of sweating, terrified executives and softly says, I notice we are stressed. I mean, they are going to get eaten alive.
They really would.
It makes them sound like they just got back from a week-long silent meditation retreat. They completely lose their edge. It feels like giving an emotional weather report while
Right.
the actual ship is sinking.
Your reaction mirrors the exact pushback raised in the recorded debate we analyzed. One of the industry analysts argued that exact point. Empathy without direction sounds passive.
Right. People don't want a weather report. They want a captain to steer the ship out of the storm.
Exactly. So if a leader relies purely on empathetic observation, the team loses confidence. The fear of appearing insecure or soft is exactly what drives the villain behavior in the first place.
So how does the guide reconcile that tension? Because if this technique makes a leader look weak, they simply won't use it.
The resolution requires an executive-level adaptation. For leaders, the I notice assertion can never exist in a vacuum. It cannot stop at the observation. To maintain authority, a leader must instantly pair the neutral observation with a highly specific, concrete directive.
Oh, okay. How does that actually sound in the room during that $50 million recall?
It sounds like this. I notice the tension in this room is incredibly high right now. That is completely understandable. Here is step one. I need legal on the phone with the distributors, and I need PR drafting a holding statement within 15 minutes. Let's move.
Wow. Okay, so what does this all mean? The noticing isn't the action itself. The noticing is simply the permission slip for the team to stop panicking.
Yes, exactly.
You acknowledge the elephant in the room to instantly diffuse its power, and then you immediately pivot to decisive action so you don't look passive.
You capture the benefit of psychological safety without sacrificing an ounce of decisive authority. You prove to the room that you are highly focused but entirely unthreatened. It transforms empathy from a passive stance into a launchpad for immediate problem solving.
All right, so we have the internal insulation with the glass wall.
Yeah.
We have the verbal diffusion with the I notice directive. But we need to escalate the scenario because leadership isn't a monologue.
Definitely not.
What happens when the CEO gives that directive and a panicked VP interrupts them or pushes back aggressively?
Hmm.
A lot of the cruelty we see doesn't happen during the initial announcement. It happens when a boss feels challenged and suddenly feels this desperate, ego-driven need to reassert their dominance.
This is where we transition into the most counterintuitive strategy in the sources, the profound power of what you don't say.
What you don't say.
Right. The guide explores a foundational communication boundary known as the broken record. Now, for an underdog, say, an underestimated junior employee who is constantly talked over the broken record is a survival tool.
Right, like picking one firm sentence and repeating it verbatim.
Exactly. Like, I am not finished making my point. You repeat it over and over like a broken record to physically claim space and hold your ground against a bulldozer personality.
I can completely see how that is a lifeline for someone who normally just gets silenced. It gives them an anchor.
It does, but, and the sources make a very sharp distinction here for an executive, utilizing that verbal broken record technique is actively dangerous to their authority.
Wait, really? Why dangerous?
Because verbally repeating yourself projects profound insecurity. The guide argues that true executive authority is rooted in the implicit expectation that you only need to say something once for it to be final.
Ah, I see.
If a CEO has to repeat their directive 3 times because people are arguing, they look defensive. The moment you start repeating yourself to demand compliance, you have already surrendered your power to the chaos of the room.
That makes total sense. True power doesn't need to beg an audience to listen. So if repeating the boundary makes them look weak, how does a leader hold the line when a subordinate challenges them in front of everyone?
They utilize the executive adaptation, which is silent repetition.
Silent repetition.
You hold the boundary internally, but you entirely withhold the verbal repetition. When challenged, interrupted, or aggressively questioned, the leader's ultimate power move is to simply wait.
Just wait.
Yes. The physical act of not repeating yourself forces the aggressive party to process your original statement in the vacuum of your silence, without you ever having to justify it or defend it.
But how do you physically execute that without looking like a deer in headlights? I mean, just staring blankly at an aggressive VP seems incredibly awkward.
It can be if you don't do it right.
Right, there has to be a specific mechanism to making the silence work for you rather than against you.
There is. The guide pairs the silent repetition with a technique called the 3-second dissolve. It's a highly intentional physical sequence designed to master your biological stress response under pressure.
Okay, walk me through it.
There are 4 distinct steps. First, you place your tongue flat on the roof of your mouth.
Doing it right now, what does that do?
It forces you to stop speaking, obviously, but neurologically it also begins to engage the vagus nerve. Second, you inhale deeply for 3 full seconds.
Right.
Third, on the exhale, you intentionally drop your shoulders. When we are challenged, our shoulders instinctively hike up to our ears in a defensive posture. Dropping them manually releases that physical tension and sends a signal to your brain that you are not under physical attack.
Makes sense. And the fourth step?
Fourth, you maintain complete silence while looking directly at the person who interrupted you.
Honestly, just visualizing myself doing that in a high-stakes scenario gives me a spike of anxiety.
It's intense. 3 seconds of dead silence in a boardroom while adrenaline is pumping feels like 3 hours. People might think you're having a stroke or you've lost your mind. If someone challenges me and I just pause, breathe, and drop my shoulders, my immediate fear is they'll think I've frozen in panic.
This raises an important question about how humans, and particularly ambitious leaders, perceive silence. The sources spend a lot of time deconstructing this specific anxiety. The fear that silence equals incompetence is almost entirely ego-driven.
Ego-driven.
Yeah, it's the ego demanding that you verbally justify your existence in the room. But the biological and psychological reality of what actually happens in that room is entirely different from what your ego fears.
What is the reality then? If I execute the 3-second dissolve, what is actually happening to the people watching me?
Internally, you are short-circuiting your sympathetic nervous system. You are preventing the adrenaline dump that leads to a cruel, snapping remark. But externally, the physical shift transforms you into the absolute eye of the storm.
The eye of the storm. Because you are the only person in the room not vibrating with reactive anxiety, the room naturally recalibrates to your frequency. The person who interrupted you will actually lean in. It instantly shifts the power dynamic. You project a grounded authority that shouting or repeating yourself could never achieve. You become the thermostat in real time.
That is incredible. The physics of silence pulling the room's attention to you.
Hmm.
But I have a massive structural concern with everything we have covered so far.
Okay, let's hear it.
The glass wall to block guilt. The I notice directive to regulate the amygdala, the silent repetition, and vagus nerve activation. These are brilliant, biologically sound strategies. In a vacuum, they are flawless,
Right, in a vacuum.
but executing them in the heat of the moment. When the stock is plummeting, your phone is exploding, and your team is in full panic mode. That requires an almost superhuman level of presence. How does an actual flawed human executive ensure they use these tools instead of just defaulting to cruelty, yelling, and snapping?
That is the ultimate bottleneck of conscious communication. Knowing the tools is useless if you can't access them when your heart rate hits 120 beats per minute.
Exactly.
That is why the guide provides a final, absolutely non-negotiable optimization tool to wire these habits into your brain. It is called the logbook of evidence, or, as they call it in the debate, the win list.
A logbook. So we are talking about a daily journaling practice.
It is a daily writing exercise, but it is highly structured, incredibly brief, and purely evidence-based. The process is this. You spend exactly 90 seconds every single morning writing down 3 specific concrete instances from the previous day where you successfully communicated with dignity under pressure.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because this bridges the gap between theory and reality.
Yeah.
It's about neuroplasticity.
Yes,
I'll
exactly.
use an analogy. It is exactly like practicing free throws in basketball.
Yeah.
You do not wait for the final 10 seconds of a championship game to figure out your shooting form.
No, you'd miss every time.
You practice the exact muscle movements in an empty gym every single morning, thousands of times. So that when the stadium is screaming and the pressure is on, your body bypasses the panic and just defaults to the practiced motion automatically. The fundamental philosophy here is that high pressure reveals what you practice.
High pressure reveals what you practice. That is the exact underlying philosophy. If you do not actively practice the mechanics of conscious communication, your brain will take the path of least resistance under stress. And that path is usually reactivity and defensive anger.
Right.
The logbook is how an executive forces their brain to recognize and myelinate the neural pathways of dignity.
So what specifically is a CEO writing in this 90-second logbook? Because the underdog might be writing, I survived the meeting without getting talked over. What does the executive's win list look like?
The executive uses it to document highly specific micro wins that actively counteract their fear of becoming the villain. The entries are intensely practical. Like, when the marketing team delivered bad numbers, I used the 3-second dissolve and asked a clarifying question instead of snapping.
Oh, that's incredibly specific.
Or, I told the board of directors no on the timeline, and I did it in a calm, measured tone. Or even just summarizing the day. 3 times today I felt the impulse to yell, and 3 times today I led without cruelty.
3 times today I led without cruelty. Writing that down physically, every single morning, you are literally architecting your own professional composure.
You really are.
You're proving to your own brain that you are capable of holding power without weaponizing it.
You are building an undeniable archive of your own dignity. By repeatedly forcing your brain to focus on these wins, you build the mental armor required for leadership. You guarantee that when the massive crisis does hit, composure and silent repetition are your automatic biological responses.
You eliminate the collateral damage entirely.
Exactly. You permanently shift from being a reactive thermometer to a highly conscious, regulating thermostat.
This has been such a profound reframing of what it actually means to wield power in a professional environment. For you listening, whether you are managing a scrappy 3-person startup or a sprawling corporate division, the true weight of your leadership is not just determined by your ability to make the right financial pivot.
No, not at all.
It's determined by how your physical and verbal behavior impacts the nervous systems of the people tasked with executing those pivots.
That is the inescapable truth found in these sources. While setting boundaries might be mere survival mechanisms for an underdog, for you, the leader holding the leverage, they are the critical armor necessary to protect your team from the toxic fallout of your own stress.
It's what prevents you from becoming the villain in someone else's career story. It really is the dividing line between being a boss who merely holds power and a leader who manages to maintain their dignity when it matters most. We've explored the internal protection of the glass wall, the brilliant psychology of pairing neutral observations with immediate directives, the biological power of silent repetition, and anchoring all of it with a logbook of evidence.
It's a full toolkit,
It really is. But I want to leave you with one final, lingering question to ponder long after this deep dive ends. If high pressure truly reveals what you practice, take a hard, honest look at how your team behaves the next time a crisis hits. Are they frantic, hiding and pointing fingers? Because their reaction might just be a mirror, reflecting exactly what you've been silently practicing all along.